the imperial regime died with hardly a whimper. Now, I want to pause on that sentence right there. We could take one word out and it would be the same as what we saw in 1990 and 91 with the fall of the Berlin Wall and so on. We'll take out the word imperial. The regime died with hardly a whimper. That's true. That's how it actually happened. So if you look at it that way, Russia's got this history of governments quietly going under. Of course, it only happened twice within 1 century. The throne of the Tsar was rather old when it fell apart, and then communism gave way itself. But it's like the Russians sort of all agree, all right, this isn't working. We have to obviously do something else. And we'll sort of see this as we go forward here. The Russians themselves all felt like they knew what needed to happen, that they're going to move towards a more liberal, more democratic government. And the Bolsheviks kind of interrupted it, as we'll see. But the imperial regime died with hardly a whimper. Popular revolution, which came suddenly, was totally unprepared. In the course of the momentous days of March 8th to 11th in 1917, February 23rd to 26th on the old-style calendar, riots and demonstrations in the capital, occasioned by a shortage of bread and coal, assumed a more serious character. On March 10, reserve battalions sent to suppress the mutineers fraternized with them instead, and there were no other troops in the city. Now that right there is the end of a government. If the government can't use guns, if the guns don't work, that's the end of the government. That guns are the only thing a government has. So even the soldiers aren't working anymore. As Christopher Hitchens has noted, the thing about police states and dictatorships is the soldiers and the police, the secret police, the torture chambers, they go on working right to the bitter end. And they did, even in the case of the Tsars, the secret police were there right to the bitter end, and then they went into hiding. The people high up in the Tsarist police ranks and stuff, people who might be have retribution brought on them now that the ways were changing. So the secret police do work up right to the very end, but when they stop working, that's when the government's done. So this is what happened here. The soldiers wouldn't suppress the uprising that was happening. Nicholas II was away at the front, and authority simply collapsed. Many officials went into hiding. Seemingly with one mind, the population of Petrograd turned to the Duma for leadership. The Duma is the House of Elected Representatives that they have. Now, it was basically, there was not much of an argument in Russia about what should be done next. It was probably going to be slow, bureaucratic, there'd probably be compromises, but everybody knew we're going to move towards greater democracy and suffrage for the people. People are going to vote. We're going to do away with the onerous bureaucratic oversight of life, the feudal oversight of life. But that's not what happened. Page 456, Nicholas II bowed to the inevitable. On the 15th of March, he abdicated for himself and his only son Alexis in favor of his brother Michael, who in turn abdicated the next day in favor of the decision of the Constituent Assembly, or in effect in favor of the provisional government, depending on that decision. So the government that the people are clobbering together and trying to get a democracy going, he says, as Tsar, I abdicate to whatever they decide to do with the government. Thus ended the rule of the Romanovs in Russia. End quote. Now, that's astonishing that it could collapse like that, and with the very last bit of prestige or power or influence that the Tsars had, the very last bit, when they basically had none at all, what teeny speck of power they had, they used to direct it to the Duma, to the People's Constituent Assembly and so on. I think it's not unreasonable to think that minus the thuggery of the Bolsheviks, these people could have ended up in some sort of wishy-washy socialist crap state, welfare state like the rest of Europe had. And it might have been better or worse than what the Soviets did, but it's hard for me to believe it could have been worse. So it looks, to all intents and purposes, as if Russia, everybody sort of knew what they were going to do, and how they were going to do it, and they sort of had patience for that to happen, but they didn't have patience to drag on under the Tsar anymore. So, quote from page 456, the provisional government was quickly recognized and hailed by the United States and other Western democracies. But in spite of its rapid and general acceptance in Russia and abroad, the new government had to deal from the very beginning with a serious rival, the Petrograd Soviet of Workers and Soldiers Deputy. Now, just so you know, a Soviet is a council. That's the meaning in the word in Russian. Soviet means the council. It's like a town meeting or a get-together in the villages. They would have a Soviet where the villagers come together and decide things, a council or a meeting. And the Workers and Soldiers Deputies Soviet in Petrograd had those soldiers under its allegiance, men with guns, an armed garrison in a major city. And this was in... These guys were butting heads with the provisional government that the Tsars had abdicated in favor of, and the people were all generally in widespread sense they were accepting, and foreign governments were even recognized in the provisional government. Yet, here's this holdup of armed, revolutionary-minded citizens that have a city, essentially. They own the garrison of the city in Petrograd. The new Soviet was formed on the 12th of March, established itself in the Duma building, and proceeded to assert its authority. So they start stretching their muscles right at once. The provisional government has been set up and is recognized, so that now this Soviet takes over the Duma, the Soviet Bolshevik Communists, what becomes them later. They take over the Duma, the house where the people assemble, and they begin issuing orders. They issue order number 1. We'll get to that in just a second. But in fact, the provisional government had been set up by the Duma in consultation with the Soviet, and had to take its unofficial partner into account in all its policies and activities. So when they were setting up this new provisional government, they did not assert independence from the Soviet Workers' Party or whatever. They collaborated with them. They wanted to bring everybody in under a big tent. They said, whatever your goals are, we'll sit down and talk about them. We have our goals, and we'll come up with some compromise, right? Well, the compromise ended with the people, the thugs with guns, taking control. But let me continue the quote. So they had to consult this Soviet for all of their actions. Moreover, the Soviet acted authoritatively on its own. So the one government had to ask the Soviets if this is okay, but the Soviets of Petrograd Workers' Party issued orders without asking the provisional government, and sometimes directly contradicted the efforts of the ministers. So not only was it doing things on its own, but it was saying, no, that government says to do X and Y and Z, we say not to do X, Y, and Z, or vice versa, we say do the opposite. So then they issue order number 1, like they're getting ready for a series, there's more to come. Order number 1, they issue this to the troops. This is the Soviet Petrograd, not the government that everyone's trying to recognize. The Soviet Petrograd issues the following order. The military units should be run by elected committees with officers entitled to command only during tactical operations. And this order, of course, quote, played a role in the demoralization and eventual collapse of the Russian army. Following the Petrograd lead, Soviets began to be formed all over Russia. So the army was dissolved and disbanded over time through demoralization and these orders and stuff from the Soviet Petrograd. Do you think that the soldiers in the Soviet Petrograd got to elect? No, they didn't elect their officers. Their officers had control and in the end would end up shooting and executing people on summary executions. So while they're building up their little thug state within the state, they are issuing hypocritical orders to the army that the army shouldn't have to put up with orders and stuff.